You have never truly comprehended a single thought, experienced by the person sitting right next to you. The assumption that human beings share a standardized baseline of consciousness is a biological falsehood. Two individuals sit in a quiet living room. They are discussing a sudden financial crisis. Watch closely how they react. The first individual speaks rapidly. Their eyes track back and forth linearly. They are actively verbalizing an internal monologue, using physical speech to process the rising panic. The second individual sits entirely silent. Their eyes are permanently fixed on a blank wall. Their jaw muscles are locked and tense. Their breathing is shallow and restricted. The first individual observes this physical state. They immediately interpret the silence as total apathy. But here is the brutal physical reality. The second individual lacks an internal monologue entirely. Their brain does not utilize spoken language to think. Right now, their neural circuitry is firing uncontrollably, processing the crisis through rapid visual sequences, flashing high-definition images of eviction, visceral sensory projections of absolute poverty. This massive visual data flood triggers severe physiological dread. Their autonomic nervous system is in full panic, but they completely lack the active linguistic neural pathways. They cannot instantaneously vocalize this internal terror. If the fundamental architecture of our thoughts is this radically segregated, what exact physiological mechanisms are driving this divide? And how much of our perceived reality are we mutually hallucinating? Between 4% and 10% of the human population operate completely blind inside their own skulls. They experience zero standard visual imagery, a neurological state classified clinically as aphantasia. Others lack any trace of an internal vocal narrative, operating in a condition known as Anauralia. The fundamental medium of human thought is not a shared experience. It is a highly fragmented biological lottery. The actual mechanism of visual memory is brutally mechanical. It relies on a strict top-down processing chain. The prefrontal cortex acts as the command center. It fires electrical signals backward through the brain structure, targeting the visual cortex located in the occipital lobe. It attempts to recreate sensory data without external stimuli. But in aphantasia, neuroimaging reveals a stark structural disconnect. This specific neural pathway is functionally severed. The prefrontal cortex fires its electrical command, but the signal terminates in the void. The visual cortex remains entirely dormant. No image is ever rendered, but the extreme opposite exists on the exact same spectrum. Hyperphantasic individuals possess a hyper-dense neural architecture. They demonstrate excessive, unbroken functional connectivity. The wiring between their frontal cognitive networks and sensory cortices is overgrown. When they mentally simulate a scenario, their visual cortex erupts. It activates with the exact same measurable electrical intensity as a brain processing actual, physical photons hitting the retina. Their neural hardware literally cannot differentiate between an internal memory and ocular reality. Watch close how they react under pressure. A police detective asks an eyewitness to recall a suspect's face. The witness closes their physical eyes to block ambient room light. Instantly, their pupils physically dilate and contract behind closed lids. The autonomic nervous system is actively adjusting, responding to the lighting conditions of a hallucinated memory. Their eyes dart back and forth in rapid, jerky saccades. They are scanning across a completely empty physical visual field. They are physically reading a high-resolution neural projection. They state the exact shade of the suspect's jacket, because their brain is currently staring directly at it. This invisible neurological disparity dictates all human interaction. It generates severe, chronic socio-cognitive friction. Individuals are routinely and pathologically misdiagnosed, labeled as chronically inattentive or lacking fundamental empathy, classified as cognitively impaired by standardized clinical systems. This happens for one strictly mechanical reason. Their physical neural hardware is fundamentally incompatible. It refuses to generate the standardized linguistic or visual outputs. outputs blindly demanded by a neurotypical societal structure. But here is the brutal physical reality. If we cannot even share the same foundational sensory imagination, how do we ever manage to transmit data to each other? The actual fatal mechanism is terrifying. We are forced to take our vast, multidimensional sensory data and crush it through a brutally narrow, linear bottleneck. Every single multimodal experience your brain generates is actively mutilated. Visual data, auditory frequencies, and raw conceptual frameworks, they must all be aggressively compressed. They are biologically degraded just to survive the translation, all to be forced through the crude mechanical apparatus of human speech. Human perception does not happen in a straight line. Conceptual thinking occurs primarily in the brain's right hemisphere. It operates purely as a massively parallel processing engine. It absorbs the ambient room temperature instantly. It calculates complex visual geometry and spatial awareness simultaneously. It processes raw emotional resonance alongside physical depth perception. All of this neurological data fires in a unified, simultaneous block. But human language requires the left hemisphere. Specifically, it relies on Broca's area to construct speech, and Broca's area is strictly a serial processor. It can only process one single piece of data at a time. The actual fatal mechanism is the data transfer itself. To physically speak, the brain must violently halt its parallel processing. It must take a massive, multidimensional conceptual block and chop it into isolated, sequential fragments. These fragments are then assigned to completely arbitrary auditory symbols. We call these crude symbols words. During this specific neural handoff across the corpus callosum, the vast majority of the original cognitive data is permanently discarded. It is completely destroyed in the translation process. Watch close how they react in a standard social setting. A person attempts to explain why a new acquaintance makes them uneasy. Internally, they experience an instantaneous, highly complex intuition. A deeply encoded memory of a past abuser's micro-expression fires in the amygdala. Their baseline core body temperature physically drops by a fraction of a degree. Their spatial mapping system generates a sudden geometric flash of being cornered. This entire multi-sensory data packet hits their consciousness simultaneously. Then, another person asks the physical question, "What is wrong?" The individual pauses entirely. Their vocal cords physically tighten and restrict in the throat. They immediately drop their gaze to the floor. They perform this physical action to forcefully break incoming visual input. They are desperately trying to free up neural bandwidth for the translation. Their serial processor struggles to sequence the massive parallel data. They ultimately utter a heavily degraded, low-resolution output. "I just get a bad vibe." The internal state completely fails to map onto the external language. This permanent translation failure leaves the individual fundamentally isolated inside their skull. The external world only ever receives highly compressed, damaged data packets. It can never receive the full neurological event. This chronic inability to be accurately perceived is not merely frustrating. It directly correlates with measurable baseline levels of existential alienation. It initiates relational disintegration at a strictly biological level. But here is the brutal physical reality. We are mechanically incapable of fully articulating our internal state. We are entirely unable to transmit our true reality to the external world. Faced with this permanent neurological isolation, the human brain adapts. It executes its most dangerous default mechanism. It abandons the present physical moment entirely. The human brain spends nearly half its conscious existence hallucinating. Exactly 47% of your waking life is a biological fabrication. It actively hallucinations events that are not occurring in physical space. It directly suppresses incoming sensory data from objective reality. It forcefully overrides the physical present. It replaces the immediate environment with internally generated visual simulations. This is not a psychological flaw. It is a strictly mechanical default state. When a human organism is not actively engaged in a high-focus task, When the eyes are not tracking immediate external threats or objectives, the brain's default mode network automatically activates. The DMN seizes complete control of all available neural resources. It is the primary neural substrate for relentless internal rumination. It powers the compulsive, involuntary recall of autobiographical memories. It operates as a highly active engine for future threat simulation. The actual fatal mechanism lies in the brain's threat detection center. The human amygdala is a primitive and blind biological alarm system. It is fundamentally incapable of distinguishing between a conceptual simulation and a literal physical threat standing directly in the room. When the DMN hallucinates a past argument or a future social failure, it immediately triggers the exact same biological panic sequence. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis fires unconditionally. It violently floods the bloodstream with toxic levels of cortisol and adrenaline. Watch close how they react in a perfectly sterile environment. An individual stands at a sink washing dishes in an empty, secure kitchen. Their physical hands move rhythmically under warm running water. Suddenly, their ocular focus entirely collapses. Their eyes unfocus and stare blankly into the stainless steel basin. They are no longer processing the physical geometry of the kitchen. Within seconds, their resting heart rate spikes violently. It jumps from a calm 65 to a panicked 95 beats per minute. Their masseter jaw muscles physically lock and clench tight. Involuntary micro-frowns carve deep into their forehead. Their diaphragm rapidly restricts. Their breathing becomes rapid, shallow, and strictly thoracic. They are physically enclosed in a perfectly safe temperature-controlled room. But biologically, their organism is currently fighting for its absolute survival. They are executing a highly stressful, hypothetical verbal confrontation. A confrontation with their employer scheduled for next Tuesday. This chronic, self-induced cortisol exposure is physically corrosive. The continuous hormonal flooding physically degrades the hippocampus. It actively destroys synaptic connections in the brain's primary memory center. It severely impairs the organism's baseline immune function. It forcibly rewires the central nervous system into permanent hypervigilance. It constructs a rigid neurological baseline of generalized physical anxiety. The relentless cognitive pursuit of what is not currently happening literally damages the physical hardware of the living organism. But here is the brutal physical reality. If our default biological state forces us into stressful, simulated realities, how do we stop the machine from destroying its own host? Our only chance at survival is a manual neurological override. We must physically hijack the brain's autopilot by exploiting its oldest evolutionary sensory mapping systems. Happiness is not an abstract psychological state. Cognitive clarity is not an accidental biological mood. They are the direct clinical results of active neural resource management. It is a strictly mechanical process of reallocating physical blood flow. You are physically trapped inside a solid bone skull, locked inside with a highly evolved, hostile biological machine, a neural network that aggressively defaults to simulating lethal threats, a processor that will continuously stress its host organism until physical failure. To ensure biological stabilization, you must initiate a manual override. You must consciously hijack the brain's spatial processing hardware. You must forcefully seize electrical control of the sensory motor cortex. You must forcibly dock your consciousness into the present physical environment. You must implement an immediate physical sensory anchoring protocol. This is the exact mechanical trigger required to shut down the default mode network. You must actively monitor your physical hardware for autonomic warning signs. Detect the involuntary clenching of the masseter jaw muscles. Identify the sudden restriction of the diaphragm, causing shallow thoracic breathing. When you detect these physical markers of internal simulation, do not attempt to use thoughts to stop the neural loops. Thinking your way out of a neural hallucination simply fuels the active network. You must strictly utilize your immediate physical space. Force your optical nerves to break their dead, unfocused stare. Manually lock your visual focus onto 3 solid distinct objects in the room. Force your vocal cords to actively articulate their physical properties. State their exact geometric dimensions and visual colors aloud. Reach out and physically press your bare hand against a hard surface. Force your epidermal nerve endings to register its exact ambient temperature. This specific physical action forces an immediate biological rerouting. It aggressively pulls oxygenated blood away from the internal rumination centers. It rapidly floods the brain's sensory, motor cortex with localized blood flow. This sudden mechanical shift instantly terminates the internal hallucination. It completely crashes the simulated neural threat environment, and it rigidly locks your central nervous system back into objective physical reality. The base structural architecture of your mind is fundamentally hostile. It will automatically operate to degrade your baseline functioning. But its neural pathways are strictly and mechanically programmable. You can immediately stop being a passive observer of your own psychological deterioration. If you are ready to seize direct mechanical control of your neural hardware, subscribe. We will continue to ruthlessly dissect the physical machinery of human behavior. We will expose the exact neurological circuits operating beneath the surface. See you in the next analysis.